Okay.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this month's Trainers Forum presented by HRD Specialized Canine Training. I am Paul Martin, your host, and tonight we have guest Sonja Nordstrom. Sonja is the host of Canine Top Tales, but she is also an accomplished trainer. She comes to us having retired after 20 plus years in the FBI. She also served as a canine handler with one of her partners with History Flight, an organization that I think is near and dear to both of our hearts. Since we've both had that experience of trying to go overseas to help bring home our missing service members. And I've had the pleasure to know Sonja for a couple of years now, and I'm really excited to have her here tonight. I would, as I scrolled past here, I would ask, everybody take a moment, visit the shop, and pick up a t-shirt or a hat or something. And remember, train the dog in front of you, not the one you think you had in the past, or stay right there in the moment and train that dog in front of you. And with that, I'm going to stop bumbling around and kick it over to Sonja. So I'm going to stop sharing, and she's now got control.
And I'm going to see if I can share. So thank you, Paul, for that very nice introduction. I will, let's see what I can do here. So share. Uh-oh. I'm working on it. It'll get there. Hang on. Okay. Hopefully people are seeing, I don't know how to get rid of these little guys in the corner. So it's what it is, right?
We got it.
Are we good? Okay. So thanks everybody for, I'm sort of at a loss because I can't see any comments or anything or who's there, but either way, I'm going to try not to kill you with PowerPoint. Paul mentioned a little bit of my background, 23 years in FBI Special Agent. I worked violent crimes. NCABC is sort of the behavioral analysis profiling unit. I was a field coordinator for that. Innocent Images National Initiative is the child porn division. General police instructor, evidence response team, 10 years in LA. That's where I did most of my dog stuff for the FBI. So I actually worked 3 different dogs that deployed under, as an ERT person, and then all the other stuff. So, and I run a dog training business, and I do, detection and whatever. And then I have a personal protection dog business that's super small. So anyway, that's enough of that. So when Paul asked me to do this, he left it wide open. And it's so hard to, with 26 years of doing it, it's so hard to be left wide open. But I kind of came up with these 3 O's. And so the first of which is objectivity. My whole background, my whole drive, I'm on dog number 6. The first one didn't make it, so I washed one. But my whole methodology, idea, whatever, is to really push for precision. And in order to be precise, we have to be objective about, we always go out looking for things to improve. So it's not about always finding fault, it's about saying, hey, this is a hole. So if we're not training to expose holes, we're never going to fill holes. And then the only place we're going to find holes is when we're out on a mission, which is not the good time to find it. So objectivity is a really big thing. And I think if people go out with that kind of a mindset, of not only their dog's holes, but their holes. And that often is where a team comes in, where you can have a really good relationship with your teammates, where you can sort of have eyes on each other and you can constructively help each other. So that's 1O. The other one is observation. If we're going to be good trainers, if we're going to be good handlers, we have to be really good observers, whether it's for our teammates' dogs or for our dogs. What I see when I'm giving seminars a lot is that people don't really understand how their movements, how their actions are potentially driving the dog the wrong direction. So there is the school of thought that, oh, I'm just the chauffeur. I don't need to be any more than a chauffeur. My dog will do everything by himself. Well, I don't really buy into that entirely. Yes, we want an independent worker, but we're an integral piece of this team. And if we are somehow hampering our dog's behavior and success by harping on them or pushing them or inducing things from them, or maybe causing avoidance behaviors, or if we're just the ball and chain, or we're not enthusiastic and the dog wants feedback and we're not giving it. So there's this balance that we have to find between independent work and an independent work by the dog, yet a connection with the handler, because ultimately the handler's the one who has to say, this is where I need you to search. This is the depth at which I need you to search. You're not going for somebody who's been sitting out for 30 days on the surface. You're looking for somebody who's been buried for 30 years. So there's going to be some distinction there. So anyway, recognizing things, being a good observer, seeing how you might be going through the motions and your dog is responding a certain way. You may be wanting to change how the dog responds, and that won't happen if you're not really, really watching how you're impacting the dog. And then the last one is obligation. At the end of the day, we are all in this for different reasons. I think everybody goes into it saying, how cool, I love my dog needs a job, whatever it is. At the end of the day, we do have a responsibility. And that responsibility actually has to be what drives everything below it. It really can't be for us. Obviously, we can get a benefit from it, an emotional benefit, a sense of satisfaction. But at the end of the day, we have to be proficient at what we do. And that means we have to, if we're ever going to get involved in criminal work, for sure, you have to have the paper trail, you have to have systematic training, you have to have method, you have to be able to address, deficiencies. And there's a saying in the FBI, if it ain't on paper, it didn't happen. And so things do have to be well documented so that you can, in fact, hold up. When it comes to court cases, I'm just going to touch on it briefly, because obviously that's kind of a thing that I am pretty familiar with. When we go now for homicide cases, most often the suspects are being gleaned through telephone data, cell tower data, tracking data, cameras, everything, all of this stuff that brings us to the person we're looking at is not incredibly disputable. It's very hard to dispute a video that's in front of you. It's very hard to dispute phone data. It is what it is. It's very easy to dispute what a dog does. And this is why we really have to have our ducks in a row. And going in with that mindset that, oh, how am I going to sit and talk to what my dog's done and feel confident with what my dog's done. And that can only be done if we have good training, proofing training, handler proofing, odor proofing, environmental proofing, context proofing, all these different things. So I'm droning, sorry. So I often hear people sort of, if they're not performing well, they'll say, but I'm certified. And then they'll say, and I have a find. And I think what they may be missing is that is truly just, you get to walk through the door. Certification allows you to walk through the door. It doesn't make you, that's not the pinnacle of what you're going for. It may look like it, it may seem like it, but that's just, that's your ticket to enter the game. So you still have this incredible depth of knowledge that your dog needs, because especially in human remains, after 26 years, I've started telling detectives when I go, I said, look, you've got to understand, I pretty much can't simulate in training on a regular basis what I'm asking my dog to do in the field. So every day is kind of a new day. It's not like I put drugs on a car and I find drugs. And I know that there's more complicating things with that. But bottom line is, my dog doesn't know if he's going out looking for disarticulated remains, if he's going out looking for somebody who's been on the side of a mountain for 10 days, if he's going out looking for a clandestine grave from 75 years ago. All of these things, I can't with regularity train all of the different permutations. So that being the case, it's very difficult to train even some of those permutations, right? Maybe I get to work somebody that's been under concrete for 5 years. Once I've worked it once, I can't really effectively work it again because maybe the dog's going off of memory. So understanding that we're always kind of in novel area, we have to be very secure when we're doing training with our training aids, as limited as they may be, and the circumstances we put them in. We have to do our very, very best, because in the field, we're going to be challenged with stuff that we really can't even practice. So it's just good to be aware of that. That's part of the objectivity thing. I think we've all seen it. A team is not just a dog. You can have a good handler, good dog. You can have a good dog, bad handler. You can have a bad dog, good handler, and you can have a bad dog, bad handler. I think we've all seen each of those permutations and everything in between. It's not about rating, but it's about realizing where the improvement needs to happen. I've seen some really well-intentioned people that just don't seem to get it. I've seen people who have had dogs that are way over their head, dogs that are just incredibly great, but the handler is just losing their mind over it. So it's really hard to say. Clearly, this sort of, bottom quadrant of bad dog, bad handler is never going to work out well. But the other 3 quadrants absolutely can work out well under the right set of circumstances. Ideally, we all want to be plus plus, right? So we work to be plus plus. Dogs have jobs, humans have jobs. Dog needs to hunt, stay on task, locate, indicate. It's pretty simple. That's his world. It's a plus, it's kind of a plus or minus. We have to get them where we need them. We have to make sure that we cover everything and don't miss. We have to give the dog room. It's his job to get to the odor, not ours. We absolutely have to give a good reward, because everything is about motivation. And when I say being a good partner, it means I'm not badgering, I'm not harping, I'm not laying on your back all the time. What you got, what you got, what you got. One of my descriptions is hunting with a dog is an Easter egg hunt with a 3-year-old. Like, hey, maybe we should look over here. And then you fade away, and then you let the dog go, and the dog finds on his own, and he feels like, wow, I did that all by myself. So ideally, the dog should be thinking he's independently working. The dog should be driving the behavior. The dog should be driving the indication, not the handler, but the handler can say, ooh, I think you missed that corner. And then the dog should go and say, now the corner's clear. So it's just kind of how, if we look at it as a division of labor, and we stay in our own lane, and then we let the dog stay in their lane and don't get in their way, that's kind of in my opinion, a better way to do it. At the end of the day, to me, and that's kind of what this is going to focus on, is motivation. I think we're all kind of, and I don't know the experience level of people here, motivation is different for every dog. Motivation techniques, you don't just say, well, I played. How did you play? Did you tap into what the dog's natural tendencies are? If you have a dog that, if you've got a Malinois and you're not tugging with it, maybe that's not his favorite thing, right? If you've got a retriever and you're tugging with it, maybe that's not his favorite thing. So looking at what the dog was bred for, maybe trying to tap into some of those things that the dog thinks is great. I was exposed to a dog that was, on a team where they all must tug. And I got a hold of this dog, and I'm like, this dog is stressed out of its mind with tugging. And we went to sort of a 2-ball exchange, and it took the stress off. It made the pleasure come back. It took away the franticness and allowed the dog to sort of decompress so that it could focus on the job. So if you have distraction issues, we're not going to put an e-collar on the dog and force them to do what we want. There has to be intrinsic value in this game. There has to be a lot of pleasure in this game. There has to be a lot of reward in this game. And when there's clarity and reward and pleasure, the dog will overcome those distractions, right? So that's part of our job. And if we're not seeing how our reward system is impacting the dog, we may be missing really critical things. And even in terms of position and everything else. So so rewards doesn't always have to be play. Of course, there's toys, but we have a dog on our team who absolutely works for treats. And then when he's done, he rips brush out of the ground, and that's his fun thing. Some dogs just really thrive on praise. We give on our team very often, we let our dogs do a victory lap when they're done, and they go and they get praise and tug with every person or play with every person. Some dogs get the whole towel thing where they get to shred it. Again, we want to maximize what's best to the dog. My favorite thing might be an ice cream sundae. Your favorite thing might be nachos. It's not that I don't like nachos, but it's not really something I'm going to work for any length of time. But an ice cream sundae, I'm like, yeah, I'll work for that. So I'll bypass the maybe distraction thing to get my ice cream sundaes. So always sort of honing that in and really paying attention. Also the ability to treats, it's not just dead treat. Is it maybe an activated treat? Is it a treat that's thrown across the floor so that the dog can chase it? Are we animating the treat? Are we making the dog chase after it? Are we making it more exciting than just handing a dog treats in front of odor? I'm working a little pet dog for mold detection, and it's a 7-year-old golden doodle. And I'm like, okay, I'll give it a try. And that dog will not accept food at reward. It's too much stress. It backs away. It doesn't matter which way I turn my body. So I started chucking it across the garage floor, and the dog runs for it and comes back for more. And it loves running after. I think it decompresses it, gets it out of that hot zone of odor where it knows it's kind of supposed to do something. And that little thing loves this game. And it took just a couple of sessions. But if I had just brazenly said, I must feed at source, I must feed at source, that dog would have never worked and it would have shut down. So I think being really amenable to catering to the dog's needs and what they want, you will never learn more than if you work a bunch of like 0 drive dogs who want to do nose work, because you have to find these little sweet spots for them and they don't all just go crazy for it. Play techniques. It's not just tug. It's not just this or that. You have to let the dog win. You want to leave the dog wanting more. You have to be able to end the game and redirect without, I see people like playing like crazy and then they're telling the dog out, 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 out. And the dog's like, are you kidding? I just earned this. So letting the dog maybe decompress on the toy, letting it just kind of settle with the toy after you've had your fun. There's kind of nothing more fun for a dog than that rabbit that it's trying to put in its mouth and that rabbit just escapes that mouth, and it makes the dog, that building that frustration. And then where the dog's always chasing. I see a lot of people throwing a toy into the dog's mouth. I equate this to having wedding cake jammed in your face. It's not necessarily fun, even if it's a good wedding cake. I really would rather chase it. There's something a lot of fun about chasing. So if you can find people or seminars or whatever, where you're really working on maximizing the power of the reward through specific techniques. In the protection sports, whether it's Mondio, French ring, PSA, IGP, whatever, they do a lot of this. And it's basically sort of drive building, even though it's I would call it really drive maximizing because the dog has the drive they have. But it's drive building, and it's by misses. It's always by misses where that dog is just clacking at it. And then they eventually get it and grab on, and then you get the resistance, and then they get to drive in. So it's a lot to be learned from the sports. I don't know if I want to open this one up for questions. If anybody has questions, the whole indirect, direct, primary, secondary reward debate. Some people say you always have to have reward at source. I've become, since probably 2005 or 6, I'm a mark, and my dog gets reward back at me or wherever I happen to throw it. Does anybody have questions? I know this is sort of a big debate. I don't know what people prefer, if they have questions about it. Yes, no?
Well, I'll jump in and say I'm a big advocate. There comes a point in time where we have the initial, directly at source when we're imprinting in those early stages, but there comes a point in time in the training that we switch off of that. And with that marker, with that, with the,
Mark.
as we advanced through our training, we should be moving to the point of rewarding indirectly. to help, as you point out, as your second bullet point on the indirect, minimize that overall handler influence.
Yeah, and one thing that has been, everybody debates it, right? And I do believe I do odor ball throws to imprint my dogs. I want them to just say, I own it, I own it, I own it, I own it. And then, partly too, because we're doing HR and half the time I'm 500 yards away. So I've gone to a whistle so I don't have to be screaming yes all over the place. But, it's, for me, at what point is the dog being marked if you're trying to present something at source? So if you're going through the machinations to try to present something at source, is it the moment you reach? Is it the moment you turn your back? What Kenny Licklider calls the Heisman, where everybody goes, they grab from the back pocket and then they prep, and the dog. So, is the dog always expecting it from one side or another? All of these things are predictors. Dogs they're predictive. Training is about a prediction. This happens, this happens, this happens. And when this happens, you pick up a leash, we go for a walk. It's a predictive behavior. I see you reach in your pocket. That's actually the moment at which you're marking the dog's behavior. And what often happens when you're trying to be sneaky with a toy and get it in line for the dog so that he, quote, thinks it's coming from source, which I don't believe that he actually does. The moment, what I see handlers doing all the time, because humans want to do everything all together. Humans always want to put everything all together. They're like, I got to do it all at once because it's going to be really fast. And they really don't have to do it all at once. But what ends up happening is they see the dog get a change of behavior. They get in that position, they reach in their pocket, and I judge nose work. So I'll watch 100 runs in a day and I'll see people doing people things, well-intentioned people things that dogs respond to very consistently. And the people things are, I see my dog in odor. What do? They close in on the dog, they reach in their pocket, and the dog turns and like, oh, well, maybe this is it. And instead of the dog driving it and saying, hey, this is it, pay me, the dog's like, oh, I was just checking something out. But if you're reaching in your pocket, sure, I'll give you an indication, right? So this is people doing people things. So if the people, instead of closing in on the dog, can say, hey, it looks like my dog's kind of in odor, I'm going to kind of fade back and give him space so that he can work that full cone or that full odor plume. And then I can just stand there very calmly, or I can walk around, or I can do whatever. And the second I get that exact behavior I want, I can go yes, or I can go tweet, or I can go click, or whatever it is I want to do. And then the dog gets that perfect expectation. So the expectation isn't about where I'm standing, how I'm moving, what I'm doing, where my hand is, what he hears. The expectation is waiting for that word where he says, I'm driving in, I'm driving in, I'm driving in. This is what I need to do to tell you. And the dog essentially gets to demand from the handler with a particular behavior. If I perform this behavior, I can make my handler reward me. And so that's kind of the mindset that we want the dog to be in. And when the dog has that, when you can communicate that clearly with your dog and that precisely with your dog, it makes his job easier because you're empowering him to be able to communicate with you. And that level of clarity goes to confidence. And then you see the dog searching with more confidence. And it just is kind of this wonderful trickle down that happens. And I'm not saying that in order to get all of that, you have to do an indirect reward, but the precision that the indirect reward affords you, or the better chance for precision that it affords you, really does give the dog that opportunity to have that level of clarity, because it's not wishy-washy. It's not gray. It's not like, well, I did this last time, I'm going to try this time, because you don't want them wondering. So anyway, enough harp. So that's the whole clarity of communication thing, which I pretty much talked about. Also, so reward presentation can improve the dog. Pardon?
One moment, Sonja, we just got a question in. How long do you have your dog hold its source before you mark with a yes or a clicker? And then how long do you wait before rewarding?
For me, I use a marker as a terminal marker. So the moment at which I say yes or blow a whistle based on how far away he is, it tells the dog, to me, it means perfect. I should actually use the word perfect because I got exactly the criteria that I set is marked. Kind of like when you go to a SeaWorld thing and the dolphins in the pool, right? They tweet and then they come and get their fish. So the time between mark and reward is as long as it takes the dog to get back to me. There is no delay. There can be a delay. I mean, I could like run to the car and get the reward, but basically it's and part of my dog's reward is that speed to the reward. He loves, I mean, he comes hauling from like 100 yards, and that's part of his fun. So that kind of, and when I had a bad knee, that was really super for me. I could sit on my tailgate, I could watch my dog indicate, and I could blow a whistle and he'd come flying for his toy. And I didn't have to do anything because I was on crutches in the snow. So there's that, there's the convenience of it. It's very different, you know, when you're working a dog on a leash and you're walking around a car, it's very easy to drop a toy over the head. But with us, I'm literally 100 yards away or 50 yards away or 25 or around the corner. And sometimes I do it where I don't see him. He's out of sight and I can see on my GPS, he's not moving, and I go over and there he is. So I don't have to see him to know, which you have to know the dog's right. So that's risky to do initially. But anyway, the question was, how long do I keep him? What is my criteria for the indication? That's variable. Sometimes I'm going to do it super fast if I'm doing drills. Sometimes I'm going to make it super long. And so that is never fixed because I don't want the dog to have an expectation. And this is the other thing. I tell people, be very careful if you're going to use a marker. If you are closing in on the dog, don't always mark when you're 10 feet away or 25 feet away or 30 feet away. Your dog will put all these things together. So you do have to randomize your duration. You have to randomize where you do it. You have to randomize your body position when you do it so that the dog knows that the only thing it's responding to is that terminal marker. Clicker can be fine when you're first training. It's not effective in the field. And I think people think the dog hears it, they don't hear it, and then the dog's mark becomes you reaching in your pocket to toss that ball, and then you've slopped up your mark. Right? If that makes sense. So you do have to be aware as a handler of the variability of what you're doing, where the only thing that matters is the mark. And you should be able to be doing back handsprings, jumping jacks around the corner, and your dog will hold it, hold it, hold it, hold it, hold it. And obviously that choice is a successive approximation based on the level that your dog's at, if that makes sense.
They say it does make sense, and thank you.
Okay. So, and this is just kind of more of the same, right? And then this is more of the same. Sorry, I guess that's the. So the whole self-motivation, self-discovery thing, this was drilled into my head for years and years and years and years and years. So to me, if we talk about like the dopamine box or the Skinner box or all these different things that I'm sure you've all heard about, bottom line is what you're doing is you're controlling the dog's environment when you're first training, and odor is the best thing out there. And if odor's the best thing out there, you don't have to sit and say, oh, but wait, this is the best thing out here. You just kind of wait for it. And so if you can control your environment and the dog can basically go and have success, and then you mark that success or you reward that success or whatever you're going to do, that's how you build a dog up. So sometimes you'll see them with a puppy, they start in a little box and there's only one thing in the box, the dog goes to it, they get rewarded. Well, we can continue to use that same concept throughout training. So I like to induce the dog rather than telling the dog what to do. And rather than kind of having them guess what to do, because that can cause frustration, I like to set things up so that it sort of induces them to do it. So if I thought of it in the obedience context, I'm not giving them a command that they don't know, I'm sort of luring. Well, if I set up my detection environment in such a way that it almost lures the dog into doing what I want, and then I can mark that and he's got a clear understanding of the mark, or I can reward that, he's got a clear understanding of the reward, then he starts to decide and piece it together. So whenever I first start dogs, people are like, I don't think he gets it. And I'm like, he doesn't get it. But what's going to happen is I'm making it so much fun that he's going to keep trying. And then he's going to say, well, is it because of this or because of this? And when he tries the wrong thing, he's going to say, oh, I guess it's not because of that. Then he tries the right thing and he gets rewarded. So now he really is actively involved in determining what wins. And again, I don't like the total guessing game, because like if you play a game of hot or colder and nobody ever says colder, then you're like, oh my God, this is like infinite, the wrong direction, right? So I don't like the total, I'm not ever going to say no. I'm never going to say nope, or I'm never going to cry. Like, it's not like I'm saying no, no, no to the dog all the time, but I'm sort of setting a situation where the environment almost corrects the dog or lets the dog not have success. And then the best thing to do is to have success. So that's how I kind of do it. So basically it's inducing and capturing behaviors versus bribing or commanding dogs. So I don't say, show me, show me, show me, show me, or do, or search, search, search. I'm just like, hey, there's odor over there. Maybe you want, and I just wait for it. It kills people because they're sitting on the edge of their seat wanting to jump in their dog to like go make it go to odor. And I'm just standing there like, I don't know what you would ever do here. And then the dog goes, I'm like, oh my God, that was great. So the dog then learns like, oh, I can do this all by myself. So that's how you build sort of the independence. And precision, what you see is what you get. If you're sloppy, your dog will be sloppy. If you're undisciplined, your dog will probably be undisciplined, right? So if we want to do things, we want to do a successive approximation. You don't do huge jumps, you get a big zigzaggy slope, right? So everything is sort of systematic, it's thoughtful, you do one thing at a time. So if I'm going to go, okay, let's say that I work in one area, right, that has a particular kind of brush or whatever. Now I'm going to a whole new area. I don't throw down totally unknown things to the dog. I don't change 2 and 3 things at one time, right? I change one thing at one time. So if I'm going to go to a new area, maybe I reel it back in and don't do it quite so far, so that the dog goes out on faith and has a quick, easy success. And then he's like, oh, I can do that here too. I don't say, oh, well, I'm going to go to a new area, and because it's bigger, I'm going to put things 3 times as far out, because that's like the dog's like, I didn't even know why I was here. So I often will not only change one thing, but then I'll kind of reel back in another thing. And basically crawl, walk, jog, run. Don't try to play the whole symphony all at once, right? Do it by components. So that's kind of all I put together as a presentation. I just, it's kind of, I think that's all I kind of did, right? Yeah, because I didn't want to kill everybody with, stop the share. There you go. So there you go. I don't know. Questions?
I think that was some great information. And it is time for some questions. Let me get over here.
Like even just troubleshooting questions, like specific training things.
Hold on.
While you're looking for questions, I will say one other thing. I find that, and I'm a pet dog trainer too, right? So I do pet dogs, I do competition dogs, I do working dogs, I do explosives. I mean, I do a whole bunch of kind of the gamut over the last, couple of decades. And I find that, God, the dogs are really easy to train and the humans, not so much. So I think maybe people go into this saying, I've got to fix the dog, I've got to fix the dog, and maybe looking in the mirror and trying to fix themselves a little bit is maybe a different orientation. I think we're all sort of geared toward fix the dog, fix the dog.
So Nancy writes, for distraction in the search, what do you think about restarts?
Absolutely, without a doubt. So there's a training context and a working context, right? So let's talk the training context. For me, if I have a dog and it's not on task, so for example, I had a couple of seminars the last couple of weekends, and I sort of take note And some dogs, and I've noticed it even, and again, I'm telling you, if you work like nose work dogs, and some of them are great, but if you, literally like a three-legged pug, I mean, we're not talking dogs that are selected for this, but they all can do it, right? So when you work that kind of a dog, it sort of magnifies all this stuff. When you have sort of the more drivey SAR dogs, it's kind of hard to maybe not see it, but because I work all these low drive dogs, it like is like a neon sign to me. So what I've learned, and it was my own stress that I learned it from, a dog would come in and I'd be like, oh my God, I've got to get it to work. I've got to get it to perform, right? So I was all stressed about making it really good. And then I finally realized like, oh no, the dog has to completely decompress the room. So a lot of times when you've got a dog that's distracted, the first thing you want to ask is the dog checking the pool for sharks, right? And I kind of use that pool analogy. Is the dog basically making the round saying, am I safe here to even search? I see that a lot. So depending upon the size of the area, obviously if you're doing 85 million acres, that's a difficult thing to do, but some dogs are truly just scoping it out. Like, okay, is there a coyote here? Is there a wolf here? Is there a dog here? Am I safe here? I'm worried here. So you'll see them do sort of like a big perimeter, and I can tell they are not searching for target odor at all. So fine. If you can recognize, at some point we sort of accept what we have to some degree, right? So are you going to change the dog's boldness and fear level? Maybe not. Maybe with more experience, the dog will get more confident, and with more confidence in the game, the dog will say, I don't have to worry about it. Nothing, every time I come out, nothing bad happens. But when you've got a younger dog who's showing distraction behavior, it can be sex drive, which, that's a real thing and it's difficult. It can be a little bit of nerves. So I think watching those specific behaviors, watching for that avoidance behavior, watching for that I don't know why I'm here thing, a reset's great. Also, I use what's called a hot start. And I don't know how many of you are, and I use that term and I assumed everybody knew what it was, but I found out that they don't. So I'm going to briefly explain it. If I'm in a training scenario, and let's say I've seen a dog go out and it looks to me like they're checking the water for sharks, not really hunting for odor, I will say, call the dog back, put it in position, let it focus completely on me, and I will go and pretend to hide things all over the place. That will recharge the dog. The dog says, oh, we're doing that. And then the dog can go off and then they'll have success finding something. So I'll often not only do a reset, but I'll do a hot start reset. And then as the dog gets more confidence, gets more clarity, feels better, has more positive experiences in the search environment, then they're less likely to have that level of distraction. So it's a process to get to it. It doesn't just fix it overnight. But yeah, restarts for sure. Sorry for the long answer.
That was great information. From Facebook, we have a question from Carolyn on blank areas. How often do you work them, and do you reward or not reward for searching blank areas?
I wish I could give you a definitive answer. So first we have to define, and it's interesting, a blank area, right? So if you search 10 cars and 5 are blank, is that considered a blank area, or is that one big search? If I search 120 acres and I search 30 of it and it's blank and I break the dog and I have a water break, is that working a blank area? So it kind of depends, I think, on the context and what you're defining as blank. If I'm in a building, obviously searching a negative room is good. Searching a negative room with a bunch of toys on the ground and a bunch of distractors is good, right? So if we specifically target, so I guess is the definition of blank that you work the dog and then you put it away? Or is the definition that, okay, I worked it, it's just an extension of the search, or I take a break in between? And that's where I can't give you a definite answer. So I definitely will work. I will purposely go and I will put out a whole bunch of control odors that are non-target odor. And what I will often do is I will work a target odor in an area. Like, so I'll work, whatever the area is, a few hundred, I don't know, couple acres, right? So I'll work a couple acres and it'll be target odor. Then I'll go work a couple acres that has nothing and all non-target odor. And then I'll go and I'll work a target odor area again. So that, is it a blank? Kind of, but not really. So that's how I sort of manage it, because every time we go on a search, I mean, I just did a search, the dog went 22 miles. It was all day long. It was difficult for him. I'm obviously not doing that regularly in training. I mean, maybe other people do, but I don't take my dog out for 8 hours at a time and just, cover an area and grid it with a GPS. So, um, and when I'm on a search like that and the dog is communicating to me or whatever, I will intermittently reward him. Not big, just kind of acknowledge that, yeah, you're working hard and you're giving me good negatives, and so I'll just say good. So that would go to level of reward, right? So when we talk about variable, there's also this big discussion about variable reward interval, right? You've got variable interval, you've got variable level, and then you can run into troubles with that. So the dogs have an expectation, right? If I go to work and I mow your 5-acre lawn and you always pay me $50 and magically you only pay me 10, I had kind of an expectation of the 50. I'm not going to be happy even though I got paid. So sometimes I see a lot of people like, well, it's too hard to play with the toy every time, so I give food 3 times and then I give the toy. Well, I don't know if that's okay. It kind of matters. This is another thing. I don't really care what any of us are thinking. I kind of only care what your dog's thinking. So anytime you make these decisions, you have to gauge, how does your dog perceive that? And that's a question that I'm always asking, is what does your dog think about that? So for example, the whole question of variable reward, right? So they say, oh, you should be on like a 3-to-1 interval or a 4-to-1 interval, meaning your dog hits target odor, you pull it off, your dog hits target odor, you pull it off, your dog hits target odor, you reward it. So that the dog doesn't always have to be rewarded every time it gets it. So I know, and we know from rat experiments and we know from monkey experiments, we know from the science that yes, that does up a dog's motivation and it does make them really strong. But I struggle with that because I'm like, well, what if my dog's wrong? What am I going to do? I'm going to pull him off. So if he goes and indicates on a dead cow and I pull him off, he might think, well, that's just a variable reward interval, so I'm still good, right? So this is where we always have to just sort of really, really try to understand our own dog, meet their expectations. So if we go to a very controlled environment where we know there's really not going to be a distraction odor, where the dog isn't going to be wrong, then we could do a variable reward. And I do that in other contexts of training, right? Where it's a variable interval, where it's like, good boy, pull him off, go to the next one, good boy, pull him off. By the time he gets to the third one, he's like, oh my God, pay me, right? So it does jack them up, and it absolutely does make them really desirous of what you want. It makes them really strong, and it makes them really demanding. But it can also rock their world if you're not doing that in a very controlled environment where you know that they're not going to be wrong. But now I take my dog in the field, maybe he hits on a dead cat and I don't know that it is. I don't, you know what I mean? Hopefully he doesn't, hopefully we're proof, but maybe he does and I pull him off and he thinks he's great. Then I've got a big problem. Like, how do I now communicate to him? Because I don't know if he's great, right? So these are things like, sorry, but 26 years later, I don't have all the answers. And I'm always looking at, some dogs are memory dogs. Some dogs you do 1 rep and it's burned like a CD and you won't get rid of it. So I worry, my dog is an incredible memory dog. I mean, I can go 6 months from now and he will bomb over to where he last had a find or any kind of a thing. He always checks it first. He's honest about it. He won't give it if it's not there, but he always goes where he had success. So if for some reason I inadvertently reward him on the wrong thing, it's like I burned a CD. So I'm hyper cautious with a dog like that. If you've got a dog that isn't like memory-ish at all, and the dog's like, yeah, whatever, every day's, my first shepherd, I'd work the same problem. I'd send him from different directions and he'd light up like, oh my God, I'm going to go. He literally acted like it was a brand new problem. He had like zero, it was like 50 first dates with him. Every problem was a brand new problem. I could work the same thing 50 times. It would be like, wow, new problem. So with him, maybe a little bit more forgiving, but with my Dutch Shepherds, 1 rep, you're screwed. So this is why I go like nuts if people screw up my training, because I'm like, oh my God, I've got to do like 1,000 reps to undo what you just did. So again, long answer, sorry.
No, but I think it's a great answer with, because there are so many variables and so many unknowns, even though the science says this works, but the science so often is done in that controlled space, in that controlled lab, and it's not really done in the real world.
Well, here's the next question. I'm going to ask it because it comes up. I'm in the field. My dog indicates, do I reward? I don't, it's a clandestine grave, so I don't know if he's right or wrong, right? Do I reward? I'm not a 1 or a 0 on that. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Sometimes the dog has rewarded himself. He absolutely is convinced that he's right. Wrecker, the one who's in the pic, he's the one that went with history flight. And I'll tell you, variable reward, if you want to make a dog good, everything during history flight was variable reward, because we didn't get confirmation until years later. And he was indicating all over the place. And there were places where I felt like, you know what? It's more than likely that he's right. So I would reward him. And he developed a behavior pattern. He developed this thing called angry barking. He would go, he would tell me, and I'd say, okay, good boy, let's go. And he would walk in front of me backwards, barking at me in like a bark and hold. Complete and total anger, and I called it angry barking. And when it first started happening, I didn't understand it. And then I realized, oh, that's because he thinks he's right and I'm not paying and he's pissed. So it definitely did jack him up. And whenever I got home from those trips, he was like, oh my God, I can do this all day long. I'm so like, he was so on tech. So absolutely it works. But the question is, what are you putting in their brain while you're doing this? So if you're going to do it, be super careful. I would say do it in a very, very controlled environment where there's no way the dog's possibly getting pulled off. But again, does he think, oh, I got pulled off, so I'm wrong? Is he now going to start skipping odors? So I had a case where the dog came in, I stood in the middle of a yard, dog did a beautiful perimeter. I mean, just on the hunt, tail going, bam, 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 indication, indication, indication. And I'm like, there's no way I'm not going to reward that. And the totality of circumstances led me to believe that it was correct, right? So, and it was correct. Ultimately, it was correct. It was determined like 8 hours later that it was correct. Well, I can't go back there 8 hours later, and it's a crime scene and whatever. So my other way of thinking at, especially within the context of HR, okay, I couldn't simulate that in training. So I've got this incredible opportunity to reward my dog for something that's real, that's in the field, that's something that I can't ever make happen. And if I don't reward him, am I telling him, no, I just want you to find this little 2-ounce thing in my jar. I don't care about this thing that's right. So again, I wrestle with this because we're all like, oh, well, we'll just go set a hide for the dog. Well, now what did I teach him? I taught him, well, that thing that was over there is kind of okay, but this is really great. I'm like, that's so backward, right? So it's again, it's not like a drug dog where you maybe pull it off and then they find the drugs and then they let the dog come in and get a confirmation. We don't have that luxury. So we do have to make these choices. But I think, and this is where it goes into the court stuff, I think if you can articulate your rationale, why you chose, if your rationale is my trainer told me not to, or my trainer told me to, I say that's silly. But if you can articulate under this set of circumstances, based on the dog's behavior, based on his training, based on all the changes of behavior that I saw before and after, based on the fact that he pulled the leash out of my hand, based on the fact that he walked backwards and yelled at me and then ripped the toy out of my pocket, yeah, he got rewarded. And I found out 2.5 years later he was correct, right? So, I mean, these are not, if it's vague, no, I'm not going to reward. If I'm uncertain, I'm not going to reward. If the dog is really certain, I'm going to take my chances on that, because that is a coup de grace that I can, and it doesn't mean I go crazy with him, because God forbid, he's wrong. But
Right.
at the point he's doing that, I mean, and So my very, very first find with my German Shepherd was a surface find, so clearly obvious. Of course, I had done so many searches during the week, I forgot his toy and I left it in the car because we're like, oh, here's another dead end, right? We're going out for weeks at a time, just doing search after search after search. It's all dead end, dead end, dead end. And then sure enough, we find her. I gave him my water bottle and we went crazy with my water bottle. And no water bottle was safe from that moment on. This was such an impactful moment in his memory, in his brain, in his life. He would grab people's backpacks if they had a water bottle attached to them. So I just know the value of that huge immersion kind of odor that's been sitting for 45 days that he has sorted through and figured out and gotten to. And of course I want to reward that. So these are choices that we have to make, but we have to make them intelligently with thought, not just, well, I do it because, or I thought I should, right?
Um, I'm going to combine the next two questions. One comes from Facebook land, and the other comes from here in Zoom. Um, but they're both in regards to buried source.
Oh yeah.
From Zoom, we've got Deb that has written, I'm trying to get my dog to recognize buried source. Been digging holes that are about 6 inches deep. In one hole, I'll put a bag of teeth. I started with them not being buried. Once she caught on to that, I started covering them with a thin layer of dirt so you can't see them. She will sniff in the hole but will not give her train final response. She will go on to sniff in other holes or elsewhere, and then she comes back. Sometimes I will say good when she's sniffing the correct hole. Eventually, she gives her train final response. Should I be using something stinkier than teeth?
Yeah, so this I think goes to potentially a different discussion. I think, and I see it often, and again, it's what is the dog thinking? So if the dog is going to it and investigating it, it's probably getting odor. But I think what happens is a lot of the initial training methods are, quote, nose to source. And so I think it's more a matter of dispersed odor um, rather than the fact that it's buried. Or it could be that when you disturb the soil, and of course, you know a lot more about soil science, when you disturb soil, when you disturb vegetation, you create an influx of a lot of odor. So it's possible that
Mhm.
that combination is somehow distracting or difficult for the dog to work through. But I think maybe a better place to start, and again, if we're going to try to do an incremental build, think of answering the other questions as to what it could be. So it's not maybe just a matter of stinky or source, and that could be a resolution, but maybe try something in a cabinet that's deep in a cabinet that the dog can't, that you let sit for 5 hours, right? So that you've got sort of this dispersed odor pool that the dog really can't put their nose on. If the dog has no problem with that problem, then you at least eliminate the possibility that maybe it's a nose to source issue. Because I had a dog, and if she couldn't put her nose, until she could put her nose on it, she wouldn't down, right? So I've seen a lot of dogs that are like that. Until they can actually make contact with it, they don't want to give the down. So that's a different training issue. And I'm not saying that that's what the issue is with this dog. I'm just saying that this is a potential thing to investigate and to eliminate as a possibility. Also, I would maybe try incrementally, maybe like I have hay, I have like a lot of leftover hay scraps. And so if you maybe put it like I did this the other day, I put it under a pallet so that the dog doesn't get nose on source, and I put it on hay. I put hay on it. So it's not soil. So again, the top layer being more equal, not as discrete as a disturbed soil, not as pungent as a disturbed soil. So if you look at these different problems and sort of work it as a gradient, you can start to narrow down what the issue might be. The other thing would be maybe dig your holes ahead. Like go out and make 7 holes, make them, fill them in, and then maybe somehow so that they're not as pungent, right? If I take grass and rub it between my hands, I can smell the grass. That's why tracking dogs are good on grass, right? So that it's not such a pungent change. And then maybe you're not masking, because for all we know, it almost masks the odor for the dog, or confuses it to the point that, well, that's too much of this other odor with it. So I do think that your idea of going with a stronger odor is a good idea. But I think that you've got these other things to potentially work through as well, meaning the nose to source issue, whether the dog will do deep hides, whether they can do dispersed odor hides, and then somehow try to have a longer set time so that the ground disturbance is not as predominant as it is when you first dig holes. What do you think about that, Paul?
Okay, well, as you were talking, she also gave us some more information to the situation. So I think those are great things, and I immediately thought about, we could be potentially masking depending on what the soil type she's actually working in.
It's silky soil, like trapping. So that's the other thing too, right?
Right. There could be no
little
escape. Yeah. But she writes that the holes are 3 days were 3 days old, but the teeth sat there in a hole for 3 days during rainstorms that came through. And this is a wooded area. So you're really, those 3 days, once we've got dispersed odor over those 3 days, and then we've got rain, we've got moisture that's coming in on top.
Yeah.
And that's going to fill those spaces, those voids between the soil particles, and you're going to have a really hard time getting odor escapage.
Yeah.
So
if it's wet, it's going to sap it. It's just going to hold it down too.
Yeah, it's just going to hold it there. So my question for you is, how is she with shorter time frames? Instead of looking at a 3-day interval, how is she with shorter time frames? How is she with more odoriferous source in those shorter time frames? And does she have that inherent, if I can't touch it, if I can't visualize it, if I can't associate an object,
right?
I might have odor, but I'm not sure about it because I can't associate one of those 3 things with it.
Yeah.
Then, we might be looking at, okay, how do we deconstruct this problem a little bit?
Paul, do you remember in Colorado? Do you remember in Colorado when we worked that, old graveyard thing up in the mountain?
Yeah.
And you remember when I came in the second day with Bigo and it had been all stirred up? Mm-hmm. And he came flying into the middle and just locked into the air after all the dogs had worked. He's definitely not object oriented, right? So, and that's the object orientation, the nose on source orientation. And also, so that's another question too. So if you're only working teeth, have you worked a pile of teeth that just sit on the surface for 3 days? Because teeth, like depending upon where I live, I'm at altitude. We are a high desert. stuff lofts like crazy. It's in like the next canyon over, for Pete's sake. So teeth in particular, the blood on them and stuff, they loft. And that odor just goes everywhere. I mean, they're climbing trees for it. So I would be curious to know, like, if you're in sort of a forested pine needly area, what if you just sort of tucked a few teeth under and then let them sit on the surface for 3 days, even though it's a little teeny bit covered by maybe pine needles? How would the dog's response? Is it the dispersion, like you were saying, is it the dispersion that's the problem? Or does the dog knock that out of the park? Because that's a big deal, right?
Oh, I think it's a huge thing. So we just got more information. This is I like this exchange. Yes, we work with teeth a lot. She does better with shorter times.
Yeah.
She's pretty good with smellier sores. She's worked on completely buried placenta a couple of times. She has a problem with having to see the source or
Okay.
kind of being able to see it, such as the source is stuffed under a log. We've
Yeah.
worked with blood and she does well with that.
Can you do can you do uh a decomp fluid poured under a log with pine needles on it and leave it for 3 days, right? So can you basically, and even the log is bad. Like that's a, believe it or not, like wide open field, no tree, no bush, no this, no that. Can you literally just pour fluid on the ground and leave it for 3 days and then come work that, right? So that you're eliminating that object orientation. The dog can still, it might actually put its nose on it and scratch still. So you still have the nose to source thing, but you will have that, gradient of longer set time. And the dog needs to learn odor drives the response, not object. And I'm afraid that sometimes the way people imprint, there's so much orientation, and this is what I was talking about with the shaping. There's so much drive for the indication that the dog, it becomes more about the performance than whatever. So I don't know. I would try to get away. Again, eliminate. Is it object? Is it nose to source? Is it dispersed odor? Is it low odor threshold? Is it, there's all these different questions that if you sort of set your problems up one at a time to address each of those questions. And I don't know that teeth are really a great buried source odor, right? I don't know.
I, I don't know that they would be the best buried source. I will say, um, yeah, you want to use that decomp fluid, um, and do a pour. Um, because one of the things, what and deconstructing this, it seems like we've got how the problem is actually set up. We've got this duration that we've got rain,
Yeah.
and that's complicating the factors. But prior to that, we've got an issue where we've potentially got a dog that does want to know, okay, here's the object, or at least there's some type of object interactivity that can be associated with it.
Yeah. And I saw that at the seminar too. It was funny because there were dogs, they'd be on odor and they're like, but I got to hit this thing because there's a thing here. Right. So it's an interesting, so you can actually set that up where you put odor adjacent to an object, and you can determine, again, the goal is to be the good observer and to be able to see, what does my dog think? If I pour decomp fluid and then I put a log or a stone or a brick, I don't know, like something, I don't let it sit next to it because then that would absorb odor, right? So you have to eliminate that, right? But if I then randomly put down a brand new object next to it, right before I work the problem, so you don't have an absorption issue, right? And you put it on the upwind side, not the downwind side, right? So that you're knowing that you're clear in your setup. If your dog gets odor and then actually indicates to the object, you know you have an object issue. if that makes sense, right? So you have to, by process of elimination with your setups, you can try to determine. So again, the setup would be, I drop fluid, I let it sit, and it doesn't even have to sit for days. It's just, whatever. I let it sit for 2 hours. I drop the fluid. Then I go and I put an object upwind of it so that the object clearly is not getting a downwind collection point, right? Because I don't want to put an object and then say, well, the odor's on the object, right? So I put it maybe a foot or 2 feet, a foot away. If the dog is not putting its nose or giving that indication truly at that odor spot, but rather picking the object to indicate, then you've got sort of an object fixation that you can then start to train away from.
Exactly. Yes, it could be that uh, a jar similar to the one that you're using for source.
Yeah, exactly.
And part of it comes along with our proofing training. One of the things that I did with my class just this week was I like to use makeup pads, cotton makeup pads, 100% cotton. I find them to be more absorbent. They're more durable than gauze pads. And I'll put them down just inside, with this exercise, I just barely put it underneath, punched it into the surface.
Contact.
So it wasn't sitting up on the surface, just underneath the surface of the soil. And what was fascinating with several of the dogs, they knew they had odor there, but instead of, trying to really source the odor, a couple of feet away was a clump of grass. A clump of grass that had come out of a lawnmower that had just mowed the grass like 2 days before. They'd all turn to the clump of grass.
Huh.
Why? Because it was the object.
Yep. Yep. Well, then you'll also have the dogs that if the object exists, they'll go to the object. If the object doesn't exist, they'll go to the odor, right? So, but then you could even say like, okay, so how fast do they indicate if the object's there versus how fast do they ultimately indicate if the object isn't there? So it doesn't mean that they won't indicate if an object's not there, but they might be a lot slower, and they don't. So think of it from the dog's perspective again. If the object's there, that's confirmation for me. So especially when you're doing these long set times, the dog they're working through who knows what. And this is the other thing that I struggle with, and I don't know the answer. So late this winter, I put up an 8 in the fall, and I let it hang all winter. And it wasn't huge. And I'm talking, 4 feet of snow, just hanging 4 feet off the ground. And it was decomp fluid in a jar with a 0.2 micron synthetic filter so that it didn't get all weird. Kept the moisture out, just hanging on a tree. And it was the most and I just did this for my seminar too. I gave it like a 1 week set time. And and again, we're at altitude. Stuff screams at altitude. Like odor just does not hang low. It just goes flying through the air because we have really thin air. Dogs were getting it at several hundred yards and just getting stuck on pool after pool after pool. And there's all this deadfall and crap and junk and hash piles and stuff. So they are literally like stuck a little bit. And they're actually giving us these little indications everywhere in all these little collection pockets. And it was such a valuable exercise because we basically just said, good boy, you're doing good, and moved on. And then what we learned from this is the pool is huge because obviously we're in the mountains. So it's draining at night and it's rising during the day and it's going 360 degrees direction. But until the dog got downwind of the actual source, they couldn't source it. So when you're taxing a dog with such a difficult problem, that object becomes a confirmation for the dog. And is the confirmation because of the volume of odor, or is it because of the object? So when we're setting up problems like this, we may actually be teaching them to be object oriented, right? But it was just, it's just
Mhm.
really, it's interesting. So we always have, again, there is no right or wrong per se, but I think people just really need to be conscientious and thinking. Don't just plop stuff out. This is sort of my pet peeve. Where's the next problem? Where's the next problem? Where's the next problem? I'm ready for another. Like, what did you learn from the last one? What did your dog learn and what did you learn? Because I really don't even care what you think. I kind of care what the dog thinks. And if you end up just going to the next problem and walking your dog into it so you can say, oh, I worked another problem, like, you really, whatever. What did the dog learn? The dog learned that he can turn to you and you'll do it for him, or you'll point to it, or you'll get impatient, or you'll put stress on him. So it's being really thoughtful, trying to dissect the problems to say, okay, why is this? So for example, I remember, and it's so funny, like, I can remember exact training scenarios where there was something that happened. So I had one, um, somebody put out a hide, and and then they used somehow, I bottom line is my dog went, and he was a bling sitter. Wrecker was a bling sitter, the one that went to World War II. He'd like put his nose on it and he'd bling, and then he'd bling sit and he'd look around for me. He'd always sit first and then he'd start looking for me. Well, then I would go up and then he'd point to it. Well, in his haste, he didn't point to the odor. He pointed to something adjacent to it. And the adjacent object was a rock, and the person had touched it with a glove. And I'm like, wait a second, do I have a dog that indicates glove odor? So I set up a problem. I put gloves, I put clean, I basically set up a problem. He did not have that issue, so I could eliminate it. And that goes in my logbook as a mitigation of, no, so it was about odor. He did go for odor. I just wanted to make sure he didn't go because it was a glove. So these are things that we always have to be looking at, and we have to be critical and objective and I'm not saying these are all science experiments, but we have to be, I'm an electrical engineer by degree, so I am a precision-based person. And I don't just take it for granted and say, found it. I'm like, why did he find it? How did he find it? How long did it take him to find it? Did he have to struggle to find it? Did he fringe when he found, right? So it's not just a 1 or a 0. There's a gradient of what's going on. And if your dog is not moving with confidence and clarity and banging that odor and hunting it down, if they're deviating, is it because they're, quote, lazy? Is it because they're not, quote, a good dog? Is it because they're showing a displacement behavior because they're not quite sure how to respond to it? And this is, I think, where a lot of people fail their dogs. Either they don't recognize that the dog just doesn't give a shit, or they don't recognize that the dog is struggling a little bit and trying to almost avoid it because there's going to be pressure there and I don't quite know what to do with it. And I see that a lot. Wow, tangential, sorry.
No, I think this is wonderful. I will say this is going to be our last question. This is the part I was combining with that also in regards to buried source. How much, if at all, do you let the dog dig or disturb the surface of a
Yeah, that's
burial?
really hard. In my experience, kind of depends on what that surface is. Sand is particularly rewarding to dogs. Digging is a rewarding behavior, right? And in the field, I have seen, okay, so I'm going to answer this with an in the field thing that always stuck in my head. There were bodies that were burned like a raging fire, burned in the bottom of a car. Somehow up on the next hillside, there was sort of a weird patch of ground, and it was an odor collection point. And I think it was such that for whatever reason, all that smoke and whatever going into the air somehow landed on this one particular patch that was sort of an anomaly, and the dogs were responding. They were giving various responses. I found at that time that the straight up passive dogs all sat it. I remember taking my dog, and he was one who would scratch the surface and sniff and said, yeah, it's not getting better. And he left it. And so again, it's a data point. Yes, do we want the dog to not disturb? Of course we do. We don't want them to disturb. We don't want them to, I can't stand testing a person that waits for their dog to dig all the way down, they hear the container and then they call it. Like, okay, come on, make your decision, right? But there are dogs, and I've had those dogs that do sort of that exploratory, like, does it get stronger or weaker? And if they do that little exploratory scratch and they say, nope, that's not it, or that exploratory scratch gets them deeper. So it's a natural behavior that I don't think should be completely crushed. And let's look from an evidentiary standpoint. And this has been an argument for dig alert people forever, and it's actually a very valid argument. For testing purposes, yes, it's a pain in the neck if your dog digs everything up, because then it's a nose to source, it really isn't valid, and blah, blah, blah. But in the real world, if something was buried 30 years ago, I don't give a crap if your dog digs and gets and digs to the point where it's satisfied, because otherwise we're not going to find it, right? So you've got to, again, balance that. If that digging behavior is just self-rewarding behavior that could be done anywhere, then you've got a problem. If that digging is productive, where the dog is really trying to make a decision and say, wait a second, I've got a little something. Is it better if I go down deeper? That's relevant. And in terms of evidence, yeah, you don't want to, and frankly, if your dog is that hot on digging, I'd just haul him off and say, good boy, and then let the people go in. But, you know, the chances of, when you've got stuff that's out there, it's getting, you know, crapped on and eaten on by predators. And I'm not suggesting your dog should go and be horrible, but there is a balance of reality and field versus testing. Testing is very artificial. Testing is just odor, response, workability. It really is not realistic. I haven't found a test yet that I feel like I have to train for the test, get it out of the way so I can train for real life. So again, we have to be able to articulate why we do what we do. If your dog just wants to go and scratch everywhere, then that's not really productive, because it's kind of just fun, and then he might just have fun digging. But if your dog is an investigative scratch and he's like, no, this is really awesome, if it's because the dog has to put nose to source first, then you've maybe got a training issue. So again, a non-answer. Aren't you happy with that?
Well, that's the reality of it, though.
Yes.
And,
Be
and with
conscientious,
seeing,
know why you do what you do, and have a reason for it, and think about it, and look at the pros and cons and find the balance, and don't just say, I have to because, right? So, and discuss it with this. These kinds of discussions are great. And I, again, 26 years, and I'm not saying that to be like, oh, 26, it's a long amount of time during which I have changed my thoughts over the years, and I continue to do so. And I will continue to do so, because we're constantly evolving, and the challenges in front of us are more difficult, and the courts are getting more difficult, and people hate cops, it's more difficult. There's all these things that are, the law is never firm. It's a very fluid thing, and we have to respond to it. And I'll tell you where the whole, sorry, Paul, you were trying to end this, and here I go. Where the problem came in was 9/11. Dogs were going out and just having supper, and it was disgusting. And people went nuts and said, no one digs, no one touches anything, treat it like a bomb. The pendulum swung to a point of maybe not being, and it was disgusting, because I remember there were dogs, and I'm like, oh my God, get that thing out of here. All it wants to do is snack. I was so mortified, I couldn't stand it. So there's that, right? And that's what drove the whole, we have to have passive, also the whole passive industry. When I first started, it was all dig alert, narcotics, everything. Well, then, you know, narcotics dogs are scratching up Jaguars and BMWs, and then they're liable, and then they have to wear booties, and then they're wrong, and it's a residual, you know. So then people also thought, oh, well, only soft dogs can be passive. Well, then we learned that it actually takes a really strong dog to have impulse control to do a strong passive, right? So everything is evolving, and the whole shaping methodology and marking methodology that has come in and gained a lot. I mean, I've been doing it since mid 2000s. It seems to be this brand new thing that hit in like 2020, but it is an ever changing thing. If you do things with thought, if you do things really paying attention to your dog and your dog's response, and how is your dog processing all of this, then it makes a difference. You don't just go through the motions.
very much so, and I'm right there with you. And you know, I don't have quite the 26 years. This is 23 years. But
Close enough for
it
government, right?
being right here, yeah, uh, being behind a dog, and being from the South, you know, things run much slower down there. Every dog was still a scratch alert, even our narcotics dogs.
Yeah, civil rights down in the
Where
South, you guys don't care about that.
right,
I was in California. It's a litigious state, man. We care about people.
yeah, yeah, and so with that, um, I can remember having a discussion in the mid 2000s with our um, chief crime scene analyst from the from the crime lab, and so forth, and he's like, I don't want any dog scratching. I don't want any dog. It's like,
Yeah, I think that's not a
an
very
investigatory dig is part of their natural thing. And it's like,
well,
well,
from
I
history,
came out
right?
of the
I mean,
yeah,
I came through the FBI Academy Body Recovery School, right? And it's the trowels and the archaeological dig and the this and that. And then I go to history flight and I'm like, it is the forensic backhoe all the way. And I got to tell you, I've done a lot of exhumations. I've been on a lot of cold, cases, and it, at some point, finding it when it's been 30 years is probably a little bit more important than whether or not a dog touched it, because maybe rodents have been, I mean, you've got, again, if it's fresh and there's fresh evidence and things, yeah. Like when I found the surface girl, I didn't even let the dog get within 10 feet, or I called him right off. I didn't wait for a final. I just said, get back here. And it was great because I could say, nope, he did not go within 10 feet of her. So again, every situation dictates, but yeah, the old, like, oh, everything's got to be paintbrushes and trowels and we scrape an inch at a time. Well, that's lovely in a textbook, but it doesn't work when you're out and you've got to dig a trench because the odor's been sucking down a hill for X number of years, and dogs, down at the pool, whatever. So yeah.
right. Yeah. You know, talking about, like, with history flight, stuff that's been out there for 75 plus years sometimes. And, you know, it they're using the policies and procedures that the military says, hey, you've got 14 days to be on this site. Well, how big's your site? Well, it could
Huge.
be 2 acres that you need to actually excavate.
Yeah.
You do what you got to do. It's not so much make it look pretty. You do a grid, but you get it done.
Well, another tip, you better make sure your backhoe's bigger than the bad guys. You don't show up, if you're bad guy buried with a backhoe, you don't show up with a pickup and a couple of shovels and think you're going to have any success. It's just not going to happen. So again,
No.
balance and thought, and using your brain and being reasonable. Obviously you don't want snacking. There's been quite a few dogs that have consumed what they shouldn't. It's just the way it is.
No, yeah, you don't want snacking, but again, like you already said, being able to articulate why things are being done the way they are, why you have trained the way you have with your dog, is one of the biggest keys. And too many, I think, are just, oh, I'm waiting for the sit. It's like, well, the sit's good, but I need to know all the stuff before the sit to make sure the sit's valid.
Yeah. Yeah. And I see that a lot. People that put more focus on the behavior, meaning, and I don't mean COB, I mean the trained indication behavior. Those are the dogs that are cheaters. Eager beaver cheaters, they're just offering. If they get frustrated, they offer. And again, this goes even to breed type, right? If you have you've got to know within your breed type what your issues are going to be. if you've got a bird dog, you're going to probably have distractions with birds. So you'd better preemptively get on that. If you've got a shepherd, you're preemptively probably going to have a dog that's not going to want to range a lot. You want to get on that. If you have like a smarty pants little border collie, it's going to be throwing all kinds of behaviors at you saying, will this work? Right paw, left paw. You'd better make their work about odor. So if you're going to pick these different breeds, you'd better know what their predisposition is so that you can preemptively counter condition that from the get-go so that you don't run into these problems. But if you've got a border collie and you want that sit day one, you're going to get screwed because that dog's going to offer you that every minute of every day, right? That's how I kind of look at it, right?
Yep.
So you've got to make it about odor, 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 odor. You can put a sit on it in a minute down the road.
Very much so. So I think this was an awesome discussion. Very much appreciate you coming on. I would like to take a few minutes to ask, when is the next seminar that you are teaching at?
Well, there's one at the end of July that's kind of a private one that's going to be up in Washington, and I'm debating what I struggle with is weather and venue availability. And here in the mountains, because of COVID, it has been flooded. So my little happy training areas get flooded. So that's why I did I planned to do one and it filled up right away. So I added a second one. So I did them back to back. And I kind of feel like now it's getting into like, campers and all kinds of things. So I'm thinking maybe in the fall, I might try to do a couple. So I have a Sonja's dog training page, and that's where I tend to post stuff. And then I post it on my personal page on Facebook. And again, I'll just warn people, I try really hard, but I often have people, they're not happy because it's business, man. We're getting down to it. I'm going for it, and trying to progress the dogs, and again, I try to bring things in close because it magnifies issues. If you just cast a dog out in a field, they look great. Well, you don't know what they're really doing. But if I bring them in, and a lot of the dogs, especially the wilderness, they really kind of struggle with that close quarters thing. And then the handlers are on top of them, and then everything kind of goes crazy. So it's a little rough start for a lot of folks. But by the time they leave, hopefully they've taken away some stuff. And it's really I find myself focusing most on handler influence in a not so much like a false alert kind of way, but how they impact the hunting and the stress that they're putting on dogs. So, I work a pretty drivey breed, and my goal is fluidity and confidence and no stress. So I really kind of go for that, and getting people to really see what their dogs are going through, and troubleshooting.
Awesome.
Troubleshooting. Yeah. So maybe in the fall. I'm kind of a spur of the moment kind of girl. I don't plan ahead very well. And I guess if somebody's within, like, let's put it this way, I'm in Utah outside of Park City. If somebody's kind of within like a 700-mile radius, I am not at all opposed to, well, you know why? Because my wrecker now is falling apart, and I can't leave him home alone. So if I can get there in my van in a day, which is about a 700-mile radius, I can, if people want to set stuff up, I can do that. And that way, they have the venues and they train where they want to train. And so that's a possibility, right? If somebody wants to try to plan something. But at this point, I can't, jump a plane because my boy needs me. He's not doing well.
And I completely understand that. And when you do, get those class dates ready, so forth, I will be sharing them.
Thank you.
There on our page for everybody. And I want to take a moment and introduce next month's guest, who literally has swam with the sharks.
There you go.
Alex Collier.
Cool.
And she will be joining us from Georgia on Sunday, June 27th, 8 p.m. Eastern. Her discussion is really going to be interesting. Some of the one, she works an atypical breed for HRD work or for search work in general, and that she works boxers. But two, she's also done some work with some of the brain studies, the neurological studies with dogs, and doing the MRI scans and so forth. So looking forward to having her on next month. And in the next couple of days, whoever knows what with my schedule, uh, this will be available to be watched again on our YouTube channel, or in a few moments after Facebook has finished processing it. You can go back and watch it again in the live stream there on the Trainers Facebook group. And with that, I want to just say, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to me by email. Make sure to check out our website for future classes. And again, my hat's off to Sonja for taking the time to visit with us tonight. And I'll be making a couple of cross-country trips here in the next couple of weeks. So, Sonja, you never know. I might be knocking on your door and saying, "Hey, let's go train for a couple of hours."
I got a couple. I got an 1865 logger up the canyon, and then I've got this graveyard over there that's semi-available. So I got a couple little spots that are kind of fun to play with.
Awesome.
Good.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you so much, Paul. It was good to chat.
But it was. Everybody, stay safe, take care of each other, but most importantly, don't lick anything. It's not good for your health. Have a good night. Thank you.
Okay. There you go. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
Talk to you later.
I'll talk to you later.